Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here today, and with me I have Michael Gates. And Michael is one of the people I adore and really admire in this world because he knows a lot about the stuff we're going to talk about today, which is obviously culture and specifically Russian negotiation culture. Now, in the last couple of days, considering what's happening in the world right now, I have had a huge number of people asking me questions about how do Russians negotiate? Why is it difficult to negotiate with Russian? And is there a specific negotiation culture in Russia and Eastern Europe? And that is exactly what Michael and I will be talking about today in just a few seconds. Hi, Michael. Nice having you here. I know it's early morning in Finland where you live. Michael, very briefly, and I have been doing some work together and doing some webinars a couple of times online where we've been discussing different kind of cultures. And today we're going to talk specifically about a Russian negotiation culture, if there's such a thing as a Russian negotiation culture. Michael has an intensive knowledge about culture from around the world. He's been doing negotiation and businesses with companies around the world. So I am so thrilled and happy and excited, Michael, that you would take some time to spend with me here today and our audience. So, Michael, my first question is really very simple. Is there a Russian negotiation culture?
Well, I think there is, but one always has to be very careful because when you're generalizing about a culture, obviously not every single person within that culture is like that or negotiates in that way. So, but with that proviso, I think that there are traits that Russians, certainly in my experience and in my research, that they have when they're negotiating. And I look forward to going into these in a little bit more depth with you soon.
Right. I think that a lot of Westerners, particularly, have found it difficult to negotiate with Russians, and to a certain degree, East Europeans as well, former Russian states. Now, I've been working with East Europeans and Russians for at least 18 to 20 years. And one of the things I have felt when I work with them and I get close to them and they start opening up a bit is that trust is an issue in general. Is that something you would agree with, that trust could be a harder thing to gain and give away in Russia and Eastern Europe compared to where we are used to negotiate, Michael?
I think it depends whether you're talking at a political or business level or at a personal level. And I've found that Russians personally are some of the people that I've trusted the most in my career.
Right.
But at a political level, and if you're looking at it externally as a country, then trust in Russia has been low. And in fact, when the last time I was in Moscow, which was a few years ago now, I had a Russian group, and typically they asked the usual question that I get asked by Russian audiences is, why don't people trust us? Which is not an easy question to answer. I mean, I usually say, well, people don't trust us, the Brits either, so we're in a similar position. Of course, it's for different reasons, but there's this big distinction between the official and the personal.
Right. I've actually heard people in Russia tell me that it's easier for them to trust a foreigner from the West than trusting other Russians. Is that something that you heard as well, Michael?
Absolutely. I mean, I've not heard a Russian say that specifically, but one other country where personal trust between nationals of that country is very low is Brazil. And I remember being in Rio de Janeiro and talking to a large Brazilian group, about 300. And, I pointed out some statistics where 62% of Norwegians say they trust fellow Norwegians, and 2.5% of Brazilians trust other Brazilians. And I said, does that mean that you would trust Norwegians more than other Brazilians? And they said, yes.
Right. That is actually interesting, isn't it? So it must be hard if you live in a country, in a culture where is that hard because of you have a history to trust your fellow people. I mean, that must make business so much harder.
Yeah, it's as though there's almost two parallel societies. There's the official world, and then there's the personal world. And even in business, I would say that you've got the official leadership structure, but then under that there are faster and more trusting ways of getting things done. Again,
Right.
these personal connections.
Right, right. Well, one of the things I've been thinking about when we talk about Russian negotiation culture is that in the world of negotiation, we all know that, most of us know at least, that typically we're talking about a very positional focus on negotiation or very collaborative focus on negotiation. The slide I just put on the screen now is basically an illustration showing a very positional way of negotiating. And positional means obviously we have a win-lose situation, or even worse, sometimes a lose-lose situation. So if we are negotiating from a positional point of view, only one of us can win, right, Michael? Either you win at the expense of me, I will win at the expense of the counterpart. It is my experience, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you know way more about this than I do, Michael, but it's my experience that a Russian negotiation culture could be more positional than collaborative when we generalize. Is that something you have experienced as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I can give you a personal story. I've got to be careful not to go into it in too much detail. But some years ago, I was teaching a person, I'll say a person, on a course in the UK, and we were doing a cross-cultural negotiation training. And when we did the first exercise, the first thing this person said to her counterparts in the negotiation was, "I win, you'll lose." And what I must say is that this person is very, very close to Putin, knows Putin personally. So it was quite interesting to have that way of approaching the negotiation, not collaborative, not integrative, but very positional.
Now, I know, Michael, that you are a very well-educated person, and you have a background in philosophy and have studied a lot of the great authors back then. If we look back into Russian history, can we gain some knowledge? Can we learn something from that? Why it might be more positional negotiation? Is it coming back from history, or is it something that was created in the last 50, 100 years?
It's always been there. And I think it's something to do with the Russian obsession with strength and power. And one of my favorite pieces of Russian literature is a poem by Pushkin, The Bronze Horseman. And in The Bronze Horseman, there's a very simple plot. A sort of minor government functionary is in St. Petersburg and looking at the statue of Peter the Great. Now, if you've ever been to St. Petersburg and seen the statue of Peter the Great, it's absolutely enormous. It's this huge bronze horseman. And as he's looking at it, this statue comes down off its plinth, the horse and Peter the Great, and the rest of the poem, it's chasing him through St. Petersburg. And on the one hand, Pushkin makes you feel the terror, but on the other hand, you can't help but be drawn like a magnet to the strength. And I think it's this issue of power and strength in negotiation that is, it goes back beyond the time of the Tsars. I think it's not a new thing.
Right. So our viewers, Michael, what should they be aware of if they are embarking on negotiation with the Russian style negotiator? How should you prepare yourself, knowing that there might be a risk or the potential of a more positional orientated negotiation with perhaps a more combative orientated counterpart?
I think, as in any negotiation, it's really important to understand the other party well. Project yourself imaginatively into their world, and particularly thinking about the characteristics which make that person or culture different from you, and think what you're going to do about it. In fact, if you think culturally, there are ways in which we're programmed from our early years to behave and think in different ways, have different values communicate differently. And perhaps we could have a look at some of those Russian values. We do have a slide before it.
Sure. Just before we dive into that, I have one more slide that actually just explain in a graphical manner how we have a more collaborative orientated negotiation. And if we look at a more collaborative versus a more positional orientated negotiation, what we kind of often see is that the parties are trying to create progress, but not at the expense of the counterpart. So in more modern negotiation philosophy in the West, at least, we have a tendency to try and find a third way where not only am I going to be more successful, but I'm trying to be more successful without you paying for it. And in some cases where we're really getting into true collaboration, I'm actually even trying to help you become more successful without I'm paying for it. And that's pretty far from what I often see is the approach in the Russian culture. But just back to what you said, Michael, let's dive into that. You wanted to focus a little bit on this one, I understand.
Yeah, the way that this diagram works, we call it human mental programming. The theory behind it is that we do get programmed by the people around us as we grow up to behave in particular ways. Is that at the bottom of that triangle, in that dark orange area, you see things which are common to humankind. So, wherever we were from, we love our young. I mean, Russians love their young, Ukrainians love their young, Brits love their young, Danes love their young, etc. We're all angry at injustice. If we see injustice, the question is, what is injustice and justice? And that may vary. We're grateful if someone does us a favor. Generally, people want to be liked, not everyone. And we want to procreate and survive. At the top, we have something that we call individual deviance. That would be someone who's very different from the base culture. But in the middle, these are some things which we've collected over the years that Russians have told us when we've asked them to describe themselves.
All right.
And well, first of all, this is an interesting one, sentimental. And if you think about what's going on at the moment, it's hard to find a rational explanation. But there's this sort of sentimentality which is almost mystical for the past, for Mother Russia, from Kiev when it was a huge center of Russian civilization and the center of the Orthodox Church. Stoicism and adversity, theatrical. And we've seen some of the theater. One of the things in negotiation that is a visual emblem is negotiators quite often have quite a debate about who sits where and what the table arrangement is like. And because position, physical position in the room can illustrate power, and we saw, and of course, all of us have seen that picture of Macron at the other end of the table. And obviously the explanation is COVID. But even if you say the explanation is COVID, then it's still that I'm so important that I need more protection than you think that you need.
Right.
And it's theatre. It's theatre. Nostalgia, again, the current thing is very much about nostalgia. Pessimistic, fear of change. Passive. Passive is a very interesting one for Russia. Because if you look at Tolstoy and War and Peace, then Tolstoy has quite an interesting view of history, because he's almost diametrically opposed to what Putin's view is, in that he believes that individuals can't really affect history. They just can't affect it. And so his hero is General Kutuzov, who's the general in charge of the Russian forces. And his villain is Napoleon. Now, Napoleon thinks he can control everything. Kutuzov, in a very Asian way, I mean, it's very much like the sorts of things one would read in the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. And in fact, Tolstoy was reading quite a lot of Lao Tzu at the time when he was writing War and Peace. What he does, he just is passive. He keeps out of the way. He just waits. And he waits for the winter to come, destroys Moscow, so the actual goal no longer exists in any reasonable form,
mm,
and he just waits. And
mm,
the French army keep going and burn themselves out. So
mm,
being passive is quite important. And we saw
mm,
at some stages Putin being quite passive.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, and I guess, Michael, isn't that kind of a technique that we can conclude is part of Russian negotiation culture as well, their ability just to wait, where we have a tendency in the West to be more impatient, right?
Absolutely. And Russians, they look like us. They don't look too different from Westerners. So it's very easy to think, well, they're not too dissimilar from us. But in fact, it's where we say at the bottom, schizophrenic. We don't mean psychologically schizophrenic, though maybe in some cases one could argue against that. But it's between East and West. And there's always been a Russian consciousness that they are partly European, but they're partly Asian. But they don't look Asian. Well, when you go further east, they are. But that is very powerful.
Yeah.
Then if you think of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, then Tolstoy generally is more European. Dostoevsky is more looking towards the East.
Right.
Interestingly, I mean, Putin spends a lot of time reading Russian literature, Russian history. Not that he necessarily learns from it, but he prefers Dostoevsky to Tolstoy. If only he preferred Tolstoy and he'd listened to General Kutuzov.
So what is it, you and I and other Westerners, what is it that we can learn from studying what you just said? What conclusions can we make about a Russian negotiation culture if we compare it to a Western one?
Well, why don't we quickly look at the next slide, which is about communication. And this is communication in negotiation. And this is sort of a diagram describing it. So very often Russians will, in a negotiation, first of all, ask the other side to speak first. And they're wanting to find out what you think before they react or respond. And this is quite an Asian characteristic.
Yeah.
Then you can go through a very theatrical, emotional stage. And Russians leaders do tend to like these big visual gestures. I mean, we remember Yeltsin standing astride the tank. That sort of gesture. He had Putin not only at the table, but when he had the conference last week, which was filmed, and he was there like King Lear in the big St. Catherine's Hall within the Kremlin, sitting at a huge distance from the others and bringing them in one by one, asking them basically, do you agree with me? And of course, you had the head of security trembling, just like the beginning of King Lear. Theatrical. If there's resistance, there can be caution and suspicion. The key point, I would say, thinking about the West, is that if you make concessions to this style of Russian negotiator, they are likely not to give another concession in return, but they're more likely to ask for more.
Right. Is that back to what you mentioned earlier, Michael, about the power thing?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
And you get it in other, I mean, we were sort of generalizing about Eastern Europe. I would say that there are some big differences. One of the toughest nationalities in negotiation that I found are Serbians. And on the program I teach at Oxford, we every now and then have a Serbian. And nearly every time an argument arises about concessions, and the Serbian there is saying, but if you make a concession, that shows weakness. So you have to be tough. You have to be tough with Russians. And I think one of the big mistakes is that, Biden is perceived as weak. I'm not making a political point here. I'm making a psychological or negotiation point. He's seen as weak.
Right.
Since the fall of communism, there has been a lot of talk in the West of soft power. And, the West has sort of thought, well, we're getting closer to Putin. Some Western leaders have said that they get on very well with him and, bringing them into the fold.
Right.
But during that time, that's the sort of waiting. And they're thinking, well, this soft power, we can defeat that with hard power.
Right. Right.
And so they tend to retreat before firmness and then wait. And then in the middle, we've got planning ahead like a chess player. Now,
Right.
in the middle of the uh, what has been going on over the past, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking, yes, Putin is behaving like a chess player. You know, he's planning several moves ahead. We don't know what he's going to do next.
Right. Right.
But then suddenly, it's like the chess player overturned the chessboard, sent the pieces flying, and ended up with the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement.
Yes.
And I just had one more metaphor that came to mind. I'm sure many of you know that Putin is a very keen judo player. He has been since he was a young boy. If you think about judo, well, you know, you use the weight of your opponent to do the work. You also use the element of surprise. And I think I saw some elements of that in his style. But now he's like the judo player who pulled out a gun and shot the opponent.
So, Michael, when we are facing a negotiator like this generic Russian negotiator we're talking about right now, we are generalizing, obviously. Is your advice that we have to show force and power, perhaps even more, if we were negotiating with another culture? Is it suddenly important to respond with pressure if you feel pressure?
Yeah, I would say so. That there should be quite a lot of pressure and force. The problem at the moment is that we're not quite sure what happens if we do apply that force. And that's a huge dilemma because, you know, we've heard these threats. And, you know, even if you're not talking purely about the current situation, you know, will the other party carry out the threats if you show power? So it's a risk.
Right.
You know, but how do you decide between a softer approach? Well, the softer approach is almost certainly not going to work.
Right.
But do you risk taking the tough approach when the stakes could be life and death?
Right. Now, what I have found with some negotiators, and I'm not talking specifically about Russian negotiators, but sometimes in negotiation, you find a counterpart that is bluffing like big time. You know, they're trying to act tough, but end of the day, they're really bluffing. You know, they're not pushing the button anyway, even though they play tough. And sometimes you have to call that bluff, right? So is there any way that you would say you could identify if a Russian negotiation culture is actually serious about the threat, or they might be bluffing back to the whole chess game? You know, there might be some bluffing involved there as well.
Yeah, I mean, this takes us really to the issue of deception and lies in a negotiation. And obviously, I'm sure both you and I would say that it's extremely important never to bluff, never to lie, never to use empty threats. But people do it. I mean, I suppose the safest thing would be to test it in a less important point. But, you know, when the stakes are so high, there is the risk that they may not be calling your bluff. And this issue of lying, I mean, in Russia, there's a concept, a word, vranyo, which means an acceptable white lie.
Okay.
And so, you know, some cultures, it is acceptable to lie.
Right.
I mean, another culture is Koreans will quite openly say, yeah, it's fine to lie in business, which many Western cultures would find very strange.
Right, right.
But this vranyo, I mean, of course, vranyo, it translates as an acceptable white lie, but you know, Putin obviously told some pretty big black lies.
Right, right. Yeah, I was actually wondering about that. Obviously, very serious things are happening right now, but I was actually wondering that, you know, during the last couple of weeks, lots of people have been asking Putin, are you going to invade Ukraine? And he denied that and said, no, I'm not. And obviously, we look back, that was a direct lie. And funny enough, I haven't actually seen the world being very focused on the fact that he was lying. Obviously, he then did something that was terrible, but you know, nobody actually said, but hang on a second, he was lying. Now, in your world, I assume, and in my world, Michael, if we have met somebody last week that we caught lying, we would lose all kind of faith and trust in them in the future, especially if it was a serious lie. But what you're saying is that in Russia, it could be kind of acceptable to use lie to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a Korean example, which could also apply, but it's quite a good one. I was working with an organisation a couple of years ago in New Zealand who deal a lot with Korea, and in the session, it was a live session, but I brought in one of my Korean colleagues who's a professor, teaches cross culture, teaches other behavioural skills courses, and so I brought him in and said to the group that you can talk to him and ask him questions. And the owner of the company, which is quite a big company, was in the room, and he said, "Look, we have discovered that some of our Korean counterparts have lied to us. What do you think about that?" Waiting for him to say, "Oh, that's terrible," he said, "It's normal." And so he said, "Hang on. It's normal. So it's okay for the Koreans to lie to us." He said, "Yeah." He said, "But what about if we lie to you?" He said, "That's fine." And you can see the shock. These moments where two cultures have a very different view on things. I mean, the challenge, if you're thinking about Russia, is that maybe within a Russian context, this may be in some way acceptable. If you're dealing with Russia as from another culture where this is really unacceptable, then it can certainly destroy the relationship.
Sure. But that's not necessarily a predominant concern from a Russian negotiator. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'd say. I mean, I really don't want to generalize, and I'm conscious that some Russians listening may completely disagree with me. But my instinct is that it wouldn't be quite as important as it would be in the West. And remember that, as I said at the beginning, the thing with Russians is to build up this very close personal relationship, and that can trump everything. The problem is, in this case, it's not as though that's even an option.
Right. Back to the trust thing, Michael, you mentioned a few minutes ago. I was actually reading a study at one point that compared trust in a system, like trust in the government and trust in the legal system, compared to personal individual trust, whether you trust your friends and partners and family and stuff. And what was interesting, exactly as you pointed out, countries like Brazil and Russia were quite low on trust towards government, authority, legal system, but were very high towards other people, friends, good friends, and people close to you. Where if you went to the Nordics, for instance, trust were extremely high towards authorities and governments and legal systems, and trust towards other people were not necessarily low. But if you took that ethical dilemma, would you lie to a court to protect your friends? Typically in the Nordic, they would say, "No, I won't. I will be honest in the court, even though I'm sacrificing my friend." But if you're asking a Russian, would you lie in court to protect their friends? They would say, "Of course, always." And that's kind of interesting as well, isn't it?
It really does vary from country to country. And, would you lie in court? Well, do you trust the legal system? I mean, so do you trust the system?
Sure.
I mean, I had a great example of this once on a flight. I was about to take off from Helsinki on I think it was a Lufthansa flight, and in the seat just in front of me was a Russian lady, and we started taxiing, and then the plane stopped, and the captain came on and said, "I'm very sorry, but there's bad weather in Munich, and we're going to have to wait for 2 hours." And you could see this lady was getting extremely agitated, because obviously she had something planned and she was going to miss her appointment, etc. And she gestured to get one of the stewardesses to come towards her. And I mean, this was a great one for body language, because this Lufthansa stewardess didn't want to get too close to her. this is pre-COVID days, and so it wasn't to do with that. And she just insisted that she could whisper in her ear, and because I was just behind, I could hear what she said. And this Russian lady said to the German stewardess, she said that the pilot just said that the plane is delayed for 2 hours because of the weather in Munich. She said, please tell me the real reason. And it's this Russian distrust in anything official. And so then the stewardess steps back into the public space and says in a loud voice, "Are you calling me a liar?" and you can see the two worlds colliding here. You know, for German, you have high trust both in other Germans and in what organizations say. But in Russia, no one trusts the organization, not even the people in the organization. But you trust individuals. And that, again, you know, these characteristics go back probably hundreds of years, millennia. You know, the very first famous Russian novel of the 19th century is by Lermontov. And in the novel, The Hero of Our Time, it's called, you've got this rider riding through the Caucasus. Now, the Caucasus, you know, you remember the Chechnya wars and all that, and it's got a very romantic, mythical appeal to Russians, and this is one thing to remember about them. And he's riding through, and this horseman stops because there's a statue there with a monument and an inscription. And anyway, the inscription is describing some historical event. And Lermontov says, and he knew that it couldn't possibly be true because it was written in stone.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Michael, I just got inspired about your talk on body language, and we have the pleasure of having Mark Bowden, who have done a small recording talking about body language from one character we talked about already, Putin himself. So I'm just going to show that clip that Mark did for us here for a couple of minutes.
Hi there, Mark Bowden here, expert in human behavior and body language. I'm going to look at a video of Russian President Putin announcing further invasion of Ukraine, February 24th, 2022. This by no means is any exhaustive piece of intelligence around him. I'm going to do a first pass on this video. Haven't seen it before, haven't logged it in my mind before. So first pass. Now, what will any of this tell us about Russian body language during negotiations? Maybe something, maybe nothing, because Putin, here's my presumption, Putin is a microculture. He's at a level that most other human beings are not at. He's within an organization that most other human beings aren't in. He's almost outside of, though part of the Russian culture, but within a micro culture of that. So it may tell us more about him specifically in this situation specifically than Russians in general negotiating. Let's take a look. Well, first of all, first frame, there with the flags, with the fascia, symbols of power next to him, phones to the side of him as well. So that harkens back to the idea of former Soviet Union. The more powerful you were, the more phone lines you had. You know, back in the day, it wasn't a digital communication system. If you had many people at your beck and call, or many people who needed to talk to you because you're super powerful, you would display that via having many phones. So that's what we see there. Sitting in a gold chair as well, you can see in the back there, so throne-like. It really is framed with the sense of a powerful monarch, almost. And by monarch, I mean, you know, one power, mono-power. All right, let's play it. I'm not going to play this with sound. I'm going to latch it up slightly to what the translation is. By the way, so not playing it with sound, that means I'm not looking at intonation of voice. I don't know enough about the Russian language and how intonation works with that to even look at intonation at this point. I'm going to look at the translation. We don't know how good the translation is, and we don't know how well it is matched to what he's saying anyway in time and sense. But let's have a look. Here we go. All right, so first thing here is, so he's clearly leant back in the chair. He's not forward into the chair, not forward into the camera. There's a sense of literally sitting back on this, a comfort level of this. He's not expanding into his territory, his space. So we could view this a couple of ways. Does he not feel as powerful as we might imagine in this situation, therefore not taking up his territory? Or is he saying, I don't even need to take up my own territory here. I'm so powerful. It could be one or the other of those. Don't know at this point. But he is expansive with one of the hands, so he is taking up somewhat the space, kind of laterally, but in the in what I'd call the table plane, he's not moving forward into the territory. Let's have a look at some more. All right, so see the brow, the head come down. That's often associated with anger. We can see movement in the nose here, side of the mouth as well. Anger, disgust, disdain, possibly. So here's the thing, I haven't done anything exhaustive today on his baseline. Really, I would need to baseline to get a sense of like, how is he normally? Is this sense of power in the forehead, anger, aggression, this sense of disgust as he's talking, here around the United Nations Charter or something around that. Is that a baseline for him? Like he normally does that around a bunch of different subjects, in that it's just normal for his nose to do that, or something to do with the language and the shapes that his mouth is making, and the upturn of one of the lips for disdain. Is that normal for the language or him speaking that language? I don't know. So these are things I would investigate here. Okay, so some of what we're seeing here is I would think him reading auto cue as well. Head turning to one side as he starts to focus on different characters or words coming up, or a different sense within this. Yes, friendship and mutual aid talking about here. So there was a shift of the head there, so probably a shift in the sense of what he's talking about, and I think we probably see that in the text as his head turns to one side, more likable, giving them his idea of the Donetsk People's Republic, this new republic, to my understanding. A shift there, being more likable as he's talking about that, listening to them, giving them an ear. Let's carry on. Yeah, I decided to conduct a special military... can't quite tell what that word is. It's hidden behind some other stuff at the moment. Yeah, and he does seem to show disgust there again. Like I'm seeing more and more of that again. I need to check it with the baseline, but that is notable to me. A military operation it was. Okay, something there about genocide and seemed something in text-wise in relation to what he's saying, but we're getting this one eyebrow go up. Again, I would need to check it with a baseline, but often eyebrow raises of that magnitude are often to do with getting approval from the audience. You're asking them, do you agree with me? Isn't that the case? Now, in this case, we're getting one eyebrow rather than both. I would be looking for both. And again, it has to move out of the baseline. And his eyebrows have been quite mobile, but not usually that mobile. Now, I'd be looking at for it in symmetry as a whole, but it could be his baseline that one eyebrow always moves more than the other. So again, I would need to check that out. Okay, he's on to we urge you to lay down arms here. Okay, there's the double eyebrow raise. We urge you to lay down arms. So that is notable. He's looking for approval on that. So I would make a prediction that he seriously thinks some people are going to watch this. Okay, let's just presume that he seriously thinks the Ukraine soldiers will watch this, and he's actually calling on them to lay down arms. That's why we get the do you approve of that? Do you agree with me? Join in on that. Okay, more movement in the glabella here. So this area kind of pointing in, more concern you can see there. Oh yeah, and you can see again that sense of disgust as well. So more concern, maybe more disgust. The concern is new, seems out of the baseline of the rest. The disgust, again, it keeps cropping up. Now, this baseline of disgust can be a personality trait as well within certain neurologists, certain personality types. This consistent kind of level sense of distaste with stuff around can be quite common. Okay, whoever would try to stop us and further create threats. Points there. Again, that's out of the baseline of all the rest, so he wants to put a lot of emphasis on this. He really wants us to pay attention to this one. Yeah, and then we see disgust again. Little eyebrow moves. Outcome.
Еще никогда не сталкивались. Мы готовы к любому развитию событий. Уверен.
There's a little, I think, swallow gesture there, but that's probably, he's speaking to autocue. It's an effort. All right, let's leave it there. Again, by no means exhaustive at all. By no means an intelligence report in any way. Just a first pass. I would go back and back and back over this. I would look at baselines, I would get language specialists in, a whole bunch of stuff would happen to get closer to what the truth might be of this, but I hope that was useful for you. Mark Bowden, expert in human behavior and body language. Catch you around.
Michael, so when we talk about meeting Russians in general, if we, and again, we're generalizing, if we have an understanding or belief that they might be a little bit more generous with the truth, how should we deal with that?
Well, you're not going to change them. You can't really very often change people. So you just have to accommodate for it. And,
That reminds me of something else, Michael. Some cultures are language-wise very direct. They will tell it as it is. They will say yes and no, and they will mean what they're saying. There's not a lot about beating around the bush. For instance, the Dutch, just to mention one culture, can be very direct.
Yeah.
How would you compare the Russian negotiation culture compared to that? Are they more close to the Middle East, where there can be a story around everything, or are they closer to the Dutch being very direct?
Well, they can certainly, in communication style, they can ramble. Putin gave a very rambling speech, a very long speech. They can do that. But they tend to blow hot and cold. And it's a little bit like what people say about India. You could also apply it to Russia, that whatever you can say about Russia, the opposite is also true. And they can sort of blow hot and cold.
Right.
And so some days they could be in a sort of raconteur mode and tell lots of stories and be very warm. Other days, very monosyllabic and silent. But I think they are generally quite direct. I mean, I have a very close Russian friend, and I met him in the US, and he's been there for about 30 years, but he's still, his soul is very Russian.
Right.
And some days you meet him and he, there's a bear hug, and he's saying things to me like, "You're my brother," and so he has a better accent than that. He's quite an American. And other days he's just like stone and cold, and you just got to be aware that it could change. So the opposite is often true in Russia.
Right.
It's not an easy culture. Churchill said something like, I can't remember the whole thing, but Russia is a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, and I can't remember the quotation. It's like I mean, this was said before, but it's like a Russian doll that you keep opening it and finding more and more there.
Right.
It's a complex culture to deal with and understand. But I would say that in negotiation, if I had to give one piece of advice, it's don't be too soft.
Right. Okay. You had another thing here you wanted to share with us, Michael, on listening habits.
Yeah, and I mean, we've sort of covered quite a bit already here, but this is sort of describing listening in negotiation. And Russians tend to be cautious listeners. They're quite good listeners, looking for the personal touch, as we've heard before, suspicious of official information, interested in foreigners, but suspicious. Here, preferring emotion to facts, but they don't always show the emotion. So, they can be very emotional under the surface without showing it. Sometimes they do show it. Apathy. Interestingly, this is like passivity, periods of inaction. But apathy is often seen as a very positive virtue by Russians.
Right.
If you look at some of the characters in Russian literature, there's I think it's an uncle in one of Turgenev's novels who is extremely apathetic. And General Kutuzov is quite apathetic in War and Peace. But that is seen often as a virtue. Sometimes the wisest thing to do is not to act.
Right. One experience I had myself of working in both Russia and East European countries and former Soviet state is that in the beginning, it changed in some of those former Soviet states in recent years. But one of the things that hit me in the beginning, I remember, Michael, is what I would call a stone face. I mean, there's a tendency in the West that we smile and we even laugh when we hear something that is funny. But I experienced and have still experienced quite often when I go east that a smile is harder to get. Is that a general trait as well from a Russian negotiator, that back to the emotional part, they may not smile as much?
A few years ago, I was giving a talk in Moscow, and the guy who was speaking before me was an American, and it was the hospitality industry. And I came in just as he was finishing. He said, "Look, my final message is, guys, why do you think that proportionally Vienna attracts far more conferences than Moscow? Moscow is much bigger and you have a small percentage compared to Vienna. Why do you think that is?" He said, "Guys, you've got to learn to smile." He said, "I go to reception at my hotel and there's but what does a smile mean?" If you ask Russians, what do you think if someone's smiling? They say they think they are stupid. So it's a sign of stupidity. I mean, obviously between friends and after some vodka in the kitchen, it's okay to smile. But particularly for strangers, and this includes in hospitality, you don't smile, because smiling indicates that you're a bit of an idiot.
So what you're saying, Michael, as a Westerner negotiating with a Russian negotiator, is that we shouldn't actually get surprised or offended if they're not smiling.
Absolutely not. And one very powerful thing is what I would call mirroring. And there was actually a survey research published last year by some American academics where they analyzed the effect of mirroring using a computer. They developed a computer program to analyze 25 million words of exchanges between lawyers and judges in patent law cases. And what they found, and the software, it measured the, I mean, this is written rather than spoken communication, but it measured the sentence length, the structure, the grammar, the syntax, vocabulary, tone, etc. And they found that where the lawyers pretty closely mirrored the language of the judges, they had double the chance of winning their case.
Right. Interesting.
The question here is, someone might say, well, why should I mirror? You know, why should I bend? I would say, where is the power?
Right.
Who needs whom more?
Right.
And if you're in a weaker position,
Right.
then I think that it can be very useful to mirror the other party's style. So if you go and meet the Russians and you notice they're not smiling, then don't smile yourself.
Right. Right. Okay. Right. Okay.
Yeah, this one. This doesn't necessarily apply in the title to negotiation. It's how management, what tone management has in a particular culture. So it's language of management. But actually, it does apply in a way. You could also apply it to negotiation. And you can see that the yellow figure, the yellow face at the top is the boss. And then there's the employee, the dark orange. And it's very coercive. It's very powerful language.
Right.
Forcing compliance.
Right.
But then the results could be fudged. So you agree.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so you might agree to something, but then you don't actually do quite what was said. But the actual moment of giving the instruction is quite coercive, a lot of pressure. And so I think it does apply in a way to negotiation as well. The next one, I think this is the final one. Obviously, when you're negotiating with someone, I'm talking more about business now, then it's really important to understand how are decisions made in the other culture. And this, you can call it leadership style. You could also call it a decision-making process. The Russian style is pretty autocratic. So you've got the yellow dot at the top, which is the boss, and an autocratic system going from top to bottom. And it's slow. However, if you look at that arrow pointing at the middle dot, under the text is trusted, efficient lieutenant. That is the personal approach. And very often, in order to get around the slowness of hierarchy, there's a sort of shadow system going on under the surface where people who are very senior also have personal connections with people lower down in the organization, and the hierarchy can be bypassed in that way, and messages can be sent both ways. If I were external negotiating with a Russian organization, then I would really try and seek out those trusted, efficient lieutenants, those who have the ear of the big boss,
right?
The means of creating a shortcut,
right?
If you build a good relationship with those people, very often in large Russian organizations, it's the PA for the CEO. Then you can move mountains, and they will end up sometimes being more loyal to you personally, even to their own organization.
Right. Okay. So that's back what you're saying. You can actually create a very high level of trust and collaboration when you have that personal relationship.
Yeah, and particularly a personal relationship with someone who can influence upwards in the organization.
Right. Okay. One thing I just want to do here at the very end, we're wrapping up in a very short time, is basically just discussing a little bit what can we do if we meet a more combative orientated counterpart. So if we, again generalizing, assume that the Russian culture could be slightly more combative and slightly more positional in their negotiation approach, there's a method we can use to deal with that more combative orientated negotiator. Now, it would take us way more time than we have right now to dive in, so I'm just going to go through these items very quickly. But one of the things I have, which can be difficult, obviously, is identifying that it could be a person with the counterpart that could be the issue. So, and please join me or agree or disagree, Michael. But one of the things we could do is, in a very kind way, ask to have a person or an individual changed in the team. Now, we can't just ask for that without offering as well that one in our team could be replaced, because that's almost a declaration of war. But that is one way, because sometimes I feel that combative behavior is basically personal chemistry that is not working. It may not be the case that it's difficult. It could just be the people that doesn't work well together. Michael, how do you think that will work in Russia if you step in and kindly ask them to replace the head of the negotiation team? And an alternative thing is not getting provoked. And one thing I think we should all remember, whether we're negotiating with a specific Russian culture or just a combative counterpart from Britain or the US or Germany or France or wherever they might be coming from, is avoid to get provoked. And I think you would agree with this one, Michael, that a combative orientated negotiators out there to test us, right? And if they can, they're happy to stress us. And that's part of the purpose by being combative. That is actually to try and push us out where we lose the greater understanding of what's going on. So in general, I would recommend count to the famous 100 or perhaps 1,000 or perhaps even 1,000,000 the second we have identified we are sitting with a more combative orientated counterpart. Delay things, back to what you said, was one of the traits or strong traits of a Russian negotiator. Basically, take time out, just don't make a decision right now, just to prolong things, delay the meeting, ask for a new meeting time. We don't actually have to go through the things right now. And by playing along, I'm not saying we should agree, but basically showing empathy. Years ago, I checked into a very nice, high-rated hotel in Asia, and I learned a lot about that hotel, Michael, because the hospitality business in Europe, as we talked about, is not that service-minded as we might find in Asia. I think you would agree with me on that. So. Yeah. I was not completely satisfied with my room, so I went back down to reception to complain. Now, if I did that somewhere in Europe, they might actually start arguing with me, saying, shut up, you checked into a very nice 5-star hotel, just go back to your room, or you can check out and go to a different place. They could actually sometimes do that in Europe. But what they did perfectly at this specific hotel in Asia is actually they said the following: I understand you feel you got a problem. Let me see if I can help you deal with that problem. And I was amazed, because they basically didn't agree or disagree. They just show empathy. I understand you feel you have a problem, so let me see if I can help deal with that problem. I learned a lot about that, and you can use this exact same thing when you're sitting in a negotiation with a more combative orientated counterpart. Back to your recommendation, Michael, I don't think we necessarily should be afraid of saying no to a combative orientated negotiator. So choose a clear formulation, but provide an alternative. We just can't sit and say no all the time, then we're not moving anything. And one of my favorite is actually asking questions and even pretend to a certain degree to be naive. And then the last proposal down there is, I'm sharing that with a little bit of a warning. But sometimes we have to use combat when we meet a combative orientated negotiator. My recommendation, though, is that we have to be sure that we're going to win the war. That's one thing. And the other recommendation is we should have tried all the other tools in the toolbox before we step in and do that. Would you agree with that, Michael, that sometimes we have to use combat when we meet a combative orientated negotiator?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the phrase that I coined at the beginning. I'd say it can be the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. It's right, what we're experiencing at the moment, but sometimes there is just no other option.
Right, exactly.
But it would be the last option.
Right.
On this list, one of the things that I think is extremely powerful is react by silence. And of course, I've had a lot of experience of that based as I am in Finland in negotiation. And really, silence can be incredibly powerful because what combative negotiators are quite often trying to get you to do is to talk yourself into a hole and reveal too much. If you're silent, there's nothing they can use against you. And, and then I'd say, one of the biggest lessons from negotiation that we can learn from Russians, and we've looked at it already, but General Kutuzov, who I mentioned, his motto, which is repeated a few times during War and Peace, is patience and time. Patience and time. So that would be my final word, I suppose, on advice on dealing with Russians.
Perfect, Michael. Thanks a million for joining me. I appreciate you took out some time to do this. I know your advice and experience is very useful for everybody who's been attending and listening in. So thanks a lot. Patience and time, Michael. Take care. I'll talk to you soon. And thank you for everybody for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Cal. Pleasure as always.